The 10,050th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is maintenance of peace and security of Ukraine. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Germany, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, Sweden, and Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Ms. Kayoko Gotoh, Officer in Charge, Europe, Central Asia and Americas, Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs and Peace Operations, and Ms. Edem Wosornu, Director, Crisis Response Division, Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite His Excellency Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. And I'll give the floor to Ms. Kayoko Gotoh.
Mr. President, Ukrainian civilians have continued to bear the brunt of the Russian Federation's escalating aerial campaign. Large-scale attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure have caused widespread and prolonged emergency power outages across most regions of the country, leaving millions without heating, water, or public transportation as temperatures plummet. Hospitals, residential buildings, railways, schools, cultural sites, diplomatic facilities, and even kindergartens have been hit. Most of the civilian casualties and damage continue to be reported in areas close to the front line, namely in Kherson, Kharkiv, Zaporizhia, Chernihiv, Sumy, and Donetsk regions of Ukraine. But the increased use of long-range weapons by the Russian Federation has placed many more civilians at risk. No region of Ukraine is safe. Just yesterday, at least 26 people, including 3 children, were reportedly killed in a Russian drone and missile attack on the western city of Ternopil. Dozens more, including children, were reportedly injured. Many remain missing under the rubble. This was one of the war's deadliest strikes on civilians. In addition, 2 other western regions, Lviv and Ivano-Frankivsk, were also hit. In the northeast, at least 46 people, including 2 children, were reportedly injured in a drone strike on the city of Kharkiv. We reiterate the Secretary General's strong condemnation of all such indiscriminate attacks against civilians. Yesterday's appalling strike follows another massive attack on 14 November, in which hundreds of Russian drones and many missiles hit Kyiv, reportedly killing at least 6 people and injuring many others. The attack also damaged the embassy of Azerbaijan, making it the second incident to impact diplomatic premises in the capital in recent months. The same day, Russian strikes also shook the Odessa region, reportedly killing 2 civilians there. We are concerned over the alarming increase in civilian casualties in Ukraine, with the overall figure from January to October 2025 already exceeding the total for all of last year. In Kyiv, the number of civilian casualties was nearly 3.8 times higher in the first 10 months of 2025 than in all of 2024. According to figures confirmed by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Since the start of the Russian Federation's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, 14,534 Ukrainian civilians, including 745 children, have been killed. 38,472 more civilians, including 2,375 children, have been injured. The war is reported to be increasingly affecting civilian populations inside the Russian Federation too. According to Russian authorities, in 2025, Ukrainian drone strikes have killed 392 people, including 22 children, in the Russian Federation and in the areas of Ukraine occupied by the Russian Federation. The United Nations is not in a position to verify or confirm these reports and figures. There are also reports of escalating Ukrainian strikes on Russian energy and industrial facilities. We recall that attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure are prohibited under international humanitarian law. They are unacceptable wherever they occur and must stop immediately. In this context, since the escalation of the attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, the United Nations, through United Nations Development Programme, has continued to work with the government of Ukraine to increase the resilience and sustainability of the country's energy sector. UN support has benefited over 6 million people, enabling continued access to electricity, heating, water, and sanitation in severely affected regions. My colleague from the Office of the Coordination for Humanitarian Affairs, Edem Wosornu, will brief on the humanitarian situation and operations. This includes updates on the alarming security threats faced by humanitarian workers, including the attack that on 14 October hit the clearly marked UN humanitarian aid convoy. Mr. President, the past months have once again highlighted the fragility of nuclear safety and security during an active war. On 23 September, Europe's largest nuclear power plant, Ukraine's Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, lost all its off-site power for the 10th time since February 2022. After a month-long outage on 23 October, the plant was successfully reconnected to Ukraine's electrical grid. The required repairs were carried out under the protection of a local ceasefire negotiated by the International Atomic Energy Agency and observed by its teams on the ground. We commend the effort of the IAEA and continue to urge the sites to act responsibly. Any nuclear incident would have unimaginable consequences, not only for Ukraine and the Russian Federations, but far beyond. Such risk must be avoided at all costs. Mr. President, in all his engagements during the General Assembly, the Secretary General spared no effort to focus attention on the war in Ukraine and to uphold the United Nations' principled position in support of a just peace. As we meet today, Under Secretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, Rosemary DiCarlo, is wrapping up a visit to Ukraine. She traveled to Kyiv to ensure continued attention on developments in Ukraine and to personally reiterate the Secretary General's message of the United Nations' unwavering solidarity with the people of Ukraine. Mr. President, earlier this year, we were encouraged by the resumption of diplomatic efforts towards a ceasefire and a search for lasting peace. Nearly 4 years into this war, as the attacks escalate and casualties grow, and calls for an immediate and complete ceasefire increase, such efforts are even more critical. We urge concerted and inclusive diplomatic efforts resulting in tangible progress towards a just and lasting peace. The alternative is to risk letting the war prolong, expand, and escalate further to even more dangerous levels. We also encourage the Russian Federation and Ukraine to continue working to secure further exchanges of prisoners of war releases of civilian detainees, and return of Ukrainian children. In this regard, we take note of today's exchange of mortal remains between the sides. I would like to conclude by reiterating the Secretary General's repeated call for full, immediate, and unconditional ceasefire as a first step towards a just, comprehensive, and sustainable peace in Ukraine. This means a peace that fully upholds Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders in line with the UN Charter, international law, and relevant UN resolutions. The United Nations stands ready to support all meaningful efforts to that end. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Gotoh for our briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Edem Wosornu.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Council, since OCHA's last briefing on 25 July, the toll of intensifying hostilities on civilians in Ukraine has continued to rise. Relentless missile and drone strikes day and night are killing and injuring civilians, destroying homes and damaging critical civilian infrastructure, including schools, health facilities, and energy distribution sites. For many, each air raid siren is a reminder that nowhere is truly safe. Civilians recently evacuated from Donetsk describe a constant buzz of drones ahead, leaving them unable to sleep or feel safe in their own homes. As freezing temperatures set in, fear, exhaustion, and recurring strikes are compounding hardship nationwide. Power outages are growing more frequent, depriving families of heat and water, the very essentials for survival. Allow me to share what we are seeing on the ground and what it means for our humanitarian response. In Pokrovsk and nearby Mirohrad, about 1,500 civilians, mostly older people, and those with limited mobility, remain trapped without reliable access to water, power, or medical care. Just 100 kilometers further north in Lyman, fighting has left 3,000 people out of reach of humanitarian assistance. They fear being completely cut off, even as humanitarians stand ready to support whenever conditions allow. This deterioration comes amid a sharp rise in attacks harming civilian infrastructure, including health facilities. The World Health Organization has verified more than 500 attacks harming healthcare this year alone, leaving 19 dead and nearly 200 people injured. This includes an incident in October, as my DPP colleague mentioned, when a missile struck a children's hospital in Kherson, injuring civilians, including hospital staff. This pattern of attacks risks eroding an international legal framework that has taken more than a century to build. International humanitarian law demands that all feasible precautions need to be taken to avoid and minimize civilian harm. Indiscriminate attacks, including those that cause disproportionate civilian death, injury, or damage, are strictly prohibited. These fundamental rules must be upheld. At the same time, displacement and humanitarian needs are growing. Some 3.7 million people are displaced in Ukraine, and nearly 6 million are refugees. This year alone, about 122,000 people have been newly displaced, mainly from frontline oblasts. The vast majority are women, children, and older people, many having moved multiple times since 2022 and now shelter in temporary collective centers or unfinished buildings. Humanitarian organizations, including the United Nations and its partners, continue to deliver humanitarian assistance wherever access allows. Collective centers are being expanded to host new arrivals, while interagency convoys deliver food, water, medical supplies to those who remain in the hardest to reach frontline communities. Between January and September, humanitarian partners reached more than 4.2 million people, over 2/3 of the target for 2025. Yet, the challenges facing humanitarian workers remain immense. They continue to operate under constant threat of shelling, restricted access, damaged infrastructure, unpredictable security conditions, all the while striving to reach most in need, often at great personal risk. In October, the UN-led convoy, as already referred to in Kherson, was attacked while trying to reach a community needing assistance. Footage of the strike later circulated on social media. It shows humanitarian vehicles being treated as targets. They are categorically not. Protecting humanitarian aid is not optional. It is both a legal obligation and a basic standard of humanity. Humanitarian access in several frontline areas is also shrinking. At the same time, access to areas under Russian occupation remains extremely constrained. We seek sustained, predictable humanitarian access where civilians face growing humanitarian needs and have received little to no international assistance. We continue to urge the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure, including humanitarian and medical personnel and assets, and for safe, predictable, and unimpeded, unfettered humanitarian access to all those in need. Mr. President, funding remains an additional major constraint to humanitarian operations. Of the $2.63 billion required under the 2025 Humanitarian Response Plan, we've received 46%. We are grateful to our donors. The winter component is thankfully 65%. May I say also in 2024, we received 77% of the funding received. We are hopeful. We urge you. Underfunding has a human cost. 72,000 displaced people lack adequate shelter. Survivors of conflict-related sexual violence are left without access to specialized care. An estimated 640,000 women and girls are affected by cuts to vital services, including those addressing gender-based violence. Overall, a growing mental health crisis leaves millions without psychosocial support. Through the humanitarian reset under Undersecretary General Tom Fletcher, we continue to sharply prioritize life-saving assistance and place affected people at the center of the response. The 2025-26 Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan is built around those core priorities, and the Ukraine Humanitarian Fund, again, thanks to our generous donors, is reinforcing them through channeling more resources to local partners and supporting targeted initiatives. Mr. President, the determination of Ukrainian communities is to survive and rebuild. That is remarkable. Teachers hold classes underground. Doctors perform surgeries without power. Volunteers drive along roads that are potentially mined to deliver aid, yet resilience is not protection. It cannot substitute for safety, dignity, or compliance with international humanitarian law, with international law. This Council and all members have a vital role to play in ensuring that international law is respected, a foundation of international peace and security. You also have a critical role in working toward an end to violence. Without it, human suffering and humanitarian needs will deepen. Humanitarian concerns must remain central to any future ceasefire or political process. The United Nations stands ready to make that happen. I thank you.
I thank Ms. Wosornu for briefing. I'll now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statement. I give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wish to thank Ms. Gotoh and Ms. Wosornu for their briefings and their contribution to the discussion. Mr. President, we are now deep into the fourth year of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, the largest armed conflict Europe has seen since World War II. A conflict that has changed modern warfare, felt first and foremost by the civilians who bear the brunt of it. The latest overnight attack by Russia is a case in point. In one of the deadliest attacks against civilians since the war began, Russian missiles and drones reportedly killed at least 26 people in Ternopil. Slovenia condemns this attack in the strongest possible terms.
With the winter approaching, Russia launched another campaign against Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Strikes on the power grid are intensifying, causing blackouts nationwide. These attacks disrupt heat, electricity, and water supply, creating extreme hardship, especially for older persons, persons with disabilities, and families with young children. These are deliberate attacks against the most vulnerable members of society. There is a clear pattern in Russia's drone warfare. No one is safe from attacks. Not near the front line, not hundreds of kilometers away. Russia's drones and missiles are the cause of more than half civilian casualties across Ukraine. Especially short-range drones surpass the impact of any other weapon type. They are killing and injuring civilians, striking homes and disrupting essential services. They are creating a coercive environment that has essentially become unlivable and has compelled thousands to flee. The Independent International Commission of Inquiry, in its latest report, concluded that these attacks constitute crimes against humanity of murder and forcible transfer of population. Mr. President, Russia is escalating its war against Ukraine. The numbers could not be clearer. Civilian casualties in Ukraine this year were 27% higher compared to the same period last year. This clearly underlines the urgent need for a full and unconditional ceasefire. 14 of us keep calling for it, yet tangible results are lacking. Slovenia stands ready to work towards a just peace, one firmly rooted in the principles of the UN Charter, a lasting peace for Ukraine, shaped by Ukraine. We need a decisive next step to end the bloodshed and stop the destruction. We need a ceasefire now. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for the statement, and I'll give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me also thank Ms. Gotoh and Ms. Wosornu for their very clear briefings. Denmark welcomes the participation of Ukraine in today's briefing, as well as other affected European countries. The broader regional security situation remains alarming. Denmark is deeply concerned by Monday's explosion on a railway line in Poland. This was an act of sabotage directed against the security of the Polish state and its citizens. Denmark stands in full solidarity with Poland. Mr. President, it is almost 2 months since the Council last discussed Ukraine. Regrettably, Russia's attacks on Ukraine's population and civilian infrastructure have continued unabated, as we have clearly heard from our briefers. Ukraine again witnessed a deadly mass attack on its cities yesterday, with over 500 drones and missiles fired in a single night. At least 25 civilians were killed and 66 injured when their residential block, their home, was hit. We condemn this attack, as we do all attacks against Ukraine's civilians, and express our sincere condolences to the victims. The recent increase in attacks on Ukraine's civilian energy infrastructure is deeply cynical, especially in light of the approaching winter. Deliberately denying the civilian population the means to keep warm, to cook, to light up their homes and access clean drinking water represents a flagrant violation of international humanitarian law. Another troubling development is the attack on electricity substations and transmission lines connected to nuclear power plants in Ukraine. This recklessly threatens the safe operation of civilian nuclear energy facilities. As we prepare to mark the 40th anniversary of the Chernobyl accident, we recall that this fallout did not respect national borders and impacted hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. We call for an immediate halt to these attacks that could lead to another nuclear accident with disastrous consequences. Mr. President, the deadly strike on a kindergarten in Kyiv on the 22nd of October stands as a symbol of Russia's disregard for civilian lives. 1 person was killed, 9 were wounded, and it was only through the bravery of Ukraine's first responders that 48 young children trapped in the burning building were saved. Unbelievably, that was not the only Russian attack on Ukraine's children that same week. On the 29th of October, Russian artillery shelled the Kherson's Children's Hospital, injuring 9 civilians, including 4 children. Russia's illegal war of aggression is having a terrible impact on Ukraine's children, including the thousands forcibly transferred and deported by the Russian authorities. International monitors and humanitarian organizations need to verify their situation, safeguard their rights, and secure their swift return to Ukraine. It is our duty to act, to defend the fundamental rights of those too young to raise their own voices. On the human rights situation in the temporarily occupied territories, we recall the Independent International Commission of Inquiry's latest report. It documents serious crimes against humanity committed by Russia's armed forces. These independent findings of the most severe violations of international law demand decisive action. Mr. President, months ago, Ukraine offered an unconditional and comprehensive ceasefire. This genuine offer still stands. Russia, on the contrary, has only offered empty promises while continuing to attack Ukraine's civilian population. We call on Russia to accept the offer of a ceasefire without delay. Denmark welcomes conversations about peace for Ukraine, peace talks that can lead to a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace. A lasting peace is, however, only possible if it's based on the principles of the UN Charter, in full respect of Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence. What is needed is a peace where Ukrainians can live in security, a peace with credible security guarantees to ensure this war cannot restart in the near future, a peace that does not reward the aggressor, leaving other countries constantly wondering if they will be next. Mr. President, let me conclude by reiterating Denmark's steadfast support to Ukraine and by reaffirming our fundamental position. Nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. Nothing about European security without Europe. Millions of Ukrainian men, women, and children have suffered more than enough for far too long. They deserve a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace. A ceasefire remains the indispensable first step on this path. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to begin by thanking Ms. Kayoko Gotoh, Acting Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs, as well as Ms. Edem Wosornu, Director of Operations at the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. I thank them for their briefings and for telling us about a conflict that has lasted far too long. Mr. President, a ceasefire is needed. France calls on all members of the Council to unite around a complete, immediate and unconditional ceasefire, which has also been requested by the Secretary-General of the United Nations. It calls on Russia to accept it and to engage in good faith in peace negotiations. The cessation of hostilities is a demand of the vast majority of the international community, as was shown recently by the official positions of the Group of Friends of Peace. Ukraine has repeated many times that it is prepared for a ceasefire. It accepted that in March when it was proposed by the United States. Ukraine has also for months expressed its readiness for peace negotiations at the highest level. Russia, on the contrary, continues to intensify its strikes on Ukrainian territory and multiplies its delaying maneuvers which fool no one. Ending this Russian aggression is a flagrant violation of the principles of the UN Charter. Stopping it is everyone's responsibility. Allowing aggression to achieve its aims would open the door on every continent to aggressive policies of revising borders, in violation of the territorial integrity and sovereign equality of states. Mr. President, the reports the Council has just heard remind us, if it were necessary, of the unacceptable humanitarian situation that Russia continues to impose on Ukrainian civilians. 26 dead, including 3 children and nearly 100 civilians in the city of Ternopil alone during the night of the 18th to the 19th of November. A few days earlier, a hospital and an embassy were hit in the capital in violation of international humanitarian law and the Vienna Convention. Among civilians, Russia also targets journalists. On the 3rd of October, French photojournalist Antony Lalican was killed in a Russian drone strike while carrying out his work and while he was wearing a press vest that clearly identified him. As winter approaches, and as every year since 2022, Russia is relentlessly attacking energy infrastructure. After thermal power plants and gas storage facilities, even electrical substations connected to nuclear power plants are not spared by these strikes, endangering nuclear safety and security, as the Director General of the IAEA has reiterated. By imposing long power outages and sometimes heating and running water outages, Russia is once again seeking to break the resistance of the Ukrainian people. But the Ukrainian people are resisting. Mr. President, France unequivocally condemns the continuation of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, as well as its irresponsible incursions of the Russian forces into the airspace of the European Union and NATO, and its serious acts of sabotage and destabilization in Europe. France recalls its unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity, reaffirmed yesterday by the United Nations General Assembly. The visit of the Ukrainian president to Paris this week, which enabled the signing of a declaration of intent on the delivery of 100 Rafale fighter jets to Ukraine, shows that France is continuing its commitment, along with all of its partners, to increase its long-term support. We are working towards a just and lasting peace. That is, a peace that does not mean Ukraine's capitulation, that preserves Ukraine's ability to exercise its right to self-defense, and that makes it possible to prevent future aggression in full respect for the independence and sovereignty of Ukraine. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for the statement, and I'll give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank Ms. Kayoko Gotoh and Ms. Edem Wosornu for their pertinent briefings. Almost 2 months after our last meeting on Ukraine in this chamber, Russia has intensified its missile and drone strikes on Ukraine. Latest reports indicate direct targeting of residential buildings and other civilian infrastructure across the country, while Ukraine's energy capabilities, with possible severe repercussions on nuclear safety, are being systematically destroyed. The numbers we just heard from our briefers are telling of the plight of civilians in Ukraine forced by Russia to survive another harsh winter in the cold and in the darkness. For the fourth consecutive year, energy needs are weaponized, with the most vulnerable groups, women, children, and the elderly, bearing the brunt of aggression. More than 3,000 children have been killed or injured in the course of this war. And today, on World Children's Day, we can't help but think of all the children whose lives and dreams were cut short. We also firmly support international efforts to ensure the safe return to Ukraine of all Ukrainian children unlawfully deported and transferred to Russia and Belarus. Once more, Greece reiterates its resolute condemnation of the massive civilian harm caused by such strikes as a blatant violation of international humanitarian law. On this occasion, we would like to express our deep sorrow for yesterday's horrendous, massive earth attacks, which targeted various Ukrainian cities and resulted to the death of 25 civilians, including 3 children. We also condemn all attacks against diplomatic missions in violation of the Vienna Convention, and we echo the Secretary General in recalling the principle of the inviolability of diplomatic premises. This war of aggression against Ukraine has broader repercussions for global peace and stability. The spillover effect of violence has affected Poland and other neighboring countries and risks to spiral out of control. Russian attacks in the Black Sea endanger lives, pose immense environmental risks, and have ripple effects on energy, food, and maritime security, as well as on supply chains on a global scale. Mr. President, Greece has consistently backed all efforts to put an end to the war in Ukraine. We call on Russia to abandon the path of escalation and engage with the US and Ukraine in goodwill. We stress the need for a full and unconditional ceasefire as a first step toward launching a genuine process that will ensure a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace. In full compliance with international law, the UN Charter, relevant General Assembly resolutions, and the Helsinki Final Act. This is clearly the urgent request of the vast majority of the UN membership. Greece reaffirms its firm and unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within internationally recognized borders, a principled stance rooted in respect for international law, the UN Charter, and consistent with the belief that the use of force cannot be tolerated. For Greece, the inviolability of borders is non-negotiable. Greece will continue to stand by Ukraine, and through the new vertical gas corridor will contribute decisively to meeting Ukraine's natural gas needs for the upcoming winter. Mr. President, it is also clear that no peace decisions for Ukraine can be taken without Ukraine. We will continue supporting an independent, democratic, and sovereign future for Ukraine, founded on credible and robust security guarantees which will deter any recurrence of armed aggression and allow Ukraine to defend itself effectively. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. We would also like to join colleagues in thanking Ms. Gotoh and Ms. Wosornu for their respective briefings. President, Pakistan expresses its profound concern over the continued hostilities that are, in fact, perpetuating the conflict in Ukraine. Well into its fourth year, the conflict has had deep impact on regional and international security landscape. The relentless fighting has also resulted in immense human suffering, and the risk of regional spillover remains a major concern. We are deeply perturbed by the expansion of hostilities targeting of civilians and civil infrastructure, and the exponentially mounting humanitarian toll. Protection of civilian lives and infrastructure should remain paramount. We reiterate the call for upholding international humanitarian law. Now, almost everyone has been saying for some time that there is no military solution to this conflict. Each day of continued fighting only deepens the wounds and the ongoing tragedy and moving the parties further away from reaching a political settlement. We again call upon the parties to demonstrate restraint, take meaningful strides towards de-escalation, and work earnestly towards a ceasefire through a sustained and meaningful dialogue process. President, we deeply regret that the diplomatic momentum generated at the start of the year by adoption of Security Council Resolution 2774, which perhaps could have been more effective if it were endorsed unanimously, and followed by multiple rounds of dialogue between the two sides, as well as continuing efforts led by President Trump to bring an end to this conflict, are yet to bear fruit. In this context, we welcome the renewed push for peace, including mediation efforts by Turkey and Qatar. A solution that is acceptable to all parties can, in fact, silence the guns and ensure lasting peace. Mindful of the complex historical context and the intricate nature of this conflict, we believe that path forward should be guided by wisdom and dialogue rather than continued hostilities and an environment of confrontation. We therefore urge all parties to demonstrate political will, to engage in a meaningful, structured, and result-oriented dialogue that addresses the security concerns of all sides, and most importantly, is anchored in the principles of the UN Charter and international law, and respects the relevant multilateral agreements. A ceasefire is the first logical and necessary step in this process. Pakistan is a firm believer in the power of dialogue and diplomacy, and will continue to support all endeavors aimed at resolving the issue peacefully and in a just, comprehensive, and durable manner. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I thank Ms. Gotoh and Ms. Wosornu for their briefing today, and I welcome the participation of the representative of Ukraine, along with other countries of the region. Colleagues, today, on World Children's Day, we are reminded of the Ukrainian children who've become victims of Russia's illegal invasion and imperialist warmongering. Of the nearly 53,000 verified civilian casualties from the start of the full-scale invasion, more than 3,000 have been children. These figures don't include the attack 2 nights ago, which reportedly killed a further 26 people, including 3 children. Russia has destroyed 358 educational institutions through aerial bombardments and damaged a further 3,161. Just last month, as we've heard, Russian strikes hit a kindergarten in Kyiv. These attacks are part of a larger pattern. Russia is ramping up its attacks on civilian and energy infrastructure, directly resulting in even greater humanitarian crisis as winter sets in. Since May, Russia has launched the 32 largest air attacks of the entire war. The latest UN Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine report has concluded that Russia's repeated attacks with short-range drones against civilians amount to crimes against humanity and war crimes. But aerial attacks are not the only threat that Ukrainian children face. The Russian government has forcibly transferred children from their homes and communities. This is a naked attempt to erase Ukrainian identity, and with it, Ukraine's future. Let's be clear. These actions are signs of desperation. Russia's victory is not inevitable. They've been throwing everything at Ukraine, but have made only minor territorial gains in the past 4 years. And Russia's losses are unsustainable. Over 1 million soldiers have been killed or wounded. The cost of war for Russia is mounting. Military spending has increased to $159 billion this year, over a third of their total budget. Money that could be spent on the well-being of Russian citizens. Yet while the rest of the world calls for a ceasefire, Russia refuses. Since March, President Zelensky has offered an unconditional ceasefire. But President Putin has repeatedly shown that he's not serious about ending this war. Everyone in this chamber has taken on the responsibility to uphold international peace and security. Everyone in this chamber should do everything in their power to pressure Russia to agree to a ceasefire. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for the statement, and I'll give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Thank you, Mr. President. We express our gratitude to the briefers for their comprehensive update. My delegation remains profoundly concerned by the continued deterioration of the security and humanitarian situation in Ukraine. The latest development, particularly the ongoing military actions, affect civilian areas, underscore the urgency and the complexity of this crisis. We are deeply troubled by the continuous escalation of attacks on civilians and essential civilian infrastructure. The protection of civilians, particularly the most vulnerable, and the preservation of critical infrastructure are non-negotiable obligations enshrined in international humanitarian law. We reiterate that all parties to the conflict must respect and uphold the principles without exception. Hospitals, power grids, and homes must never be targeted. On this occasion, as the world observes World Children's Day, marking the anniversary of the signing of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, we voice our profound alarm regarding the adverse effects of this conflict on children. Their protection must be paramount, and we urge all parties to the conflict to do so. Mr. President, we remain convinced there can be no military solution to this protracted conflict. Continued hostility only serves to prolong suffering and further diminish the prospect for a sustainable peace. Dialogue and diplomacy remain the sole means to bring about an end to this conflict. We call upon all sides to exercise utmost restraint, de-escalate the fighting, and commit to an immediate and comprehensive ceasefire. A durable resolution must address the underlying root causes of the conflict and consistent with the principles of the United Nations Charter. We underscore that a just and lasting peace will necessitate compromise, confidence-building measures, and genuine commitment to negotiations from all parties. In closing, Mr. President, my delegation reaffirms its unwavering support for all diplomatic efforts aimed at achieving a resolution that restores peace, security, and stability. As we have repeatedly said, the people of Ukraine and all those affected by this conflict deserve a future founded upon peace, security, and dignity. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Somalia for the statement, and I'll give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Thank you, Mr. President. We appreciate the participation of Ms. Kayoko Gotoh from the Division for Europe, Central Asia and the Americas of the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, and Ms. Edem Wosornu, Director of the Operations and Advocacy Division in the Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, who have provided valuable information on the situation on the ground. We take note of the presence of the representatives of the other countries honouring us with their presence. Panama would observe, based on the information presented by the speakers, that the conflict in Ukraine continues in an unacceptable spiral of violence and remains a constant item on this Council's agenda, given its length and its direct impact on the civilian population. In this regard, we reiterate that establishing a ceasefire and halting hostilities already delayed for far too long is an urgent step towards a just and lasting peace in Ukraine, in line with recent statements by the Secretary-General Antonio Guterres. Panama regrets the recent attacks, which have left dozens of civilians dead and injured, multiplied the suffering of the civilian population, especially the most vulnerable, including children, and we commemorate them today. And also there's been serious damage to infrastructure on both sides of the border. In light of this situation, Panama reaffirms that the protection of civilians is an inescapable obligation and urges that safe, unconditional access for humanitarian workers and assistance be guaranteed. Let us recall, other colleagues have done this, that in February of this year, this Council adopted Resolution 2774, which calls for a swift end to the conflict and urges progress towards a lasting peace between Ukraine and the Russian Federation. For this reason, Member States remain committed to creating conditions for dialogue between the parties to move towards this goal. Mr. President, all members of the international community must comply with Chapter 6 of the Charter and avoid actions that intensify violence or which fuel the conflict, providing weaponry, financing, or technology. Prolonging this conflict indefinitely is unacceptable. The time has come in this and in other conflicts for the civilian population, which has demonstrated extraordinary resilience, to regain and maintain confidence that their governments use resources honestly, transparently, and aimed at meeting their needs, and not to sustain a war that benefits them in no way at all. Under no circumstances can we return to times when the use of force guided international relations. Respect for the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of states must prevail in accordance with international law and the principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Panama for the statement, and now give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, President. I thank Directors Gotoh and Wosornu for their briefings. At present, the Ukraine crisis continues to drag on, with ground combat operations still ongoing. Russia and Ukraine persist in launching attacks against each other, resulting in new civilian casualties and damage to infrastructure. As another winter is around the corner, people in the conflict zone face the double whammy of warfare and bitter cold, creating a deeply concerning humanitarian situation. China once again calls on the parties to the conflict to exercise restraint, strictly comply with international humanitarian law, and effectively protect civilians and civilian infrastructure. Dialogue and negotiations represent the only viable path to resolving the Ukraine crisis. We urge the parties to demonstrate political will and swiftly embark on the path of negotiated settlement. We call on the international community to scale up humanitarian assistance, actively promote peace talks, and continue creating favorable conditions for a political solution to the crisis. Last year, China and Brazil, together with other countries, the Global South, jointly promoted the establishment of the Group of Friends for Peace. Recently, the group held another ambassadorial-level meeting and issued a statement at media stakeout, welcoming the recent engagement and talks held between the relevant parties and calling on all parties to seize the current opportunity and maintain the momentum of engagement and talks. The group advocates for de-escalation and preventing the escalation of hostilities. All parties should refrain from actions that exacerbate the conflict, including the proliferation of weapons to the parties involved. The group reaffirms that the shared goal must be to find a comprehensive, just, and lasting solution, one that addresses mutual concerns of the parties to the conflict and leads to a peace agreement negotiated directly by and acceptable to them. The group stands ready to support the next steps agreed by the relevant parties to the conflict. The UN has a role to play in fostering the diplomatic efforts and in the implementation of any peace agreement. The group calls on all parties to strictly comply with international humanitarian law and supports such humanitarian initiatives as exchange of prisoners of war. The group expresses deep concern over the negative impact of unilateral sanctions and stresses the importance of safeguarding countries' legitimate right to conduct normal international trade and economic cooperation. President, China's position on the Ukraine issue has been very clear and consistent. We have always followed the fundamental guidance of the 4 shoots proposed by President Xi Jinping, actively engaging with all relevant parties, working tirelessly for peace and striving to promote negotiations. We stand ready to continue communicating with all parties, amplify the voice of balance, objectivity and rationality of the international community, and play a constructive role in achieving an early ceasefire and advancing a political solution to the crisis. I thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, President. I thank Ms. Gotoh and Ms. Wosornu for their briefings and welcome the participation of the representatives of Ukraine, Germany, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, Sweden, and the European Union in today's meeting. Mr. President, my delegation had hoped that with the adoption of Resolution 2774 last February, that we would have seen an end to the conflict between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. While we welcome the positive diplomatic efforts and initiatives undertaken over the past 9 months, including those engagements that led to the exchange of prisoners, we regret that these efforts have not yet resulted in an end to the conflict. Instead, we continue to receive reports of escalating airstrikes and a rising civilian death toll. We deplore the mounting civilian casualties resulting from recent long-range missile and drone strikes. The latest incident yesterday reportedly claimed the lives of 26 people and wounded many others, as we just heard from Ms. Gotoh. As we've heard this afternoon as well, there has been a barrage of strikes over the past 2 months on critical infrastructure, including the power grid in Ukraine. These attacks have led to daily power outages and in some areas have caused serious disruptions to heating and water supply. Residential neighborhoods continue to come under attack, further contributing to the destruction and damage of over 230,000 buildings since the conflict began, as reported by the International Organization for Migration. From all indications, the many calls by the Security Council and the United Nations for the parties to comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law and the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution have gone unheeded. Instead, the attacks have become more deadly for civilians, with the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine documenting a 27% increase in civilian casualties compared to the same period last year. The situation is deplorable. Civilians are not collateral damage. They did not ask for this war and have little means of escaping it. 7 million are forced to live as refugees in foreign lands, while 4 million are internally displaced and forced to rely on humanitarian aid that is steadily declining due to insufficient funding. These aren't just numbers. They're human beings. Their livelihoods upended, their futures put on pause. We have consistently called on the conflict parties to uphold their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law, and we do so again today. They must take constant care to spare civilians from harm, and all precautions to minimize incidental loss of civilian life, injury, and damage. This is not just a legal obligation, but a moral imperative. IHL also explicitly protects humanitarian workers during armed conflict against acts of violence, mistreatment, arbitrary detention, and harassment. In this vein, Guyana strongly condemns the attack against an interagency humanitarian convoy carrying aid in the Kherson region last month. Such attacks should never happen and must never go unpunished. We demand unimpeded access for humanitarian workers to all civilians in need. Mr. President, much continues to be said about the ineffectiveness of the United Nations in stopping conflicts. However, it is important to recognize that the organization's effectiveness is intrinsically linked to the political will matched with concrete actions of its member states. Without active engagement and genuine determination of members to uphold their responsibilities, the United Nations cannot fulfill its mandate to maintain international peace and security. We therefore urge the parties to the conflict, as well as every member state of the United Nations, to demonstrate the necessary determination and unity to bring this devastating war to an end. We hope that the ongoing diplomatic engagements, including in Turkey, will yield concrete results. In closing, Guyana reiterates its call for full respect for the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter and the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. In this regard, we urge the Russian Federation to withdraw its military forces from the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine. We also echo the Secretary General's call for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire as a first step towards a just, comprehensive, and sustainable peace that upholds Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. We also continue to emphasize that a strong and coordinated effort must be made to end the hostilities, not only to uphold the principles of international humanitarian law, but most importantly, to protect the lives of civilians who continue to suffer on the front lines and beyond. Their safety and well-being must be placed at the forefront of all actions and decisions taken in the pursuit of peace. A call for peace is always relevant, and the choice of peace is never too late. The time to answer that call and to choose peace is now. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank Director Gotoh and OCHA Director Wosornu for the timely briefing, and welcome the representatives of Ukraine and other European community. After nearly 2 months since our last council meeting on Ukraine, we assembled here today once again, 1,364 days into this ongoing war. As Ukraine families are now gearing up the post-consecutive winter of war, the full gravity of the conflict has continued unabated. And this is occurring despite the clear calls of the international community to end the fighting and forge durable peace, to charter a brighter future for Ukraine, Russia, and the region. Under this backdrop, I'd like to expand on the following key points. First, the Republic of Korea is deeply concerned by the continuance of the war. The indiscriminated targeting of critical infrastructure remains alarming. Residential areas, energy sites, health and education facilities, even cultural locations are not spared, demonstrating the ferocity of this conflict. Attacks against the civilian and civilian infrastructure constitute a violation of international humanitarian law. In this context, we deplore yesterday's deadly attack on western Ukraine side that killed 26 people, including 3 children, in Ternopil. Second, the mounting civilian suffering and tragic humanitarian toll further exemplify the imperative of ending the war and advancing peace. Indeed, the Republic of Korea underlined the vital necessity of pursuing expedient and concrete steps toward a full, immediate, and unconditional cessation of all hostility in line with the Security Council Resolution 2774 to ensure lasting peace between Russia and Ukraine. We take this opportunity to commend the leadership of the U.S. in pursuit of peace. My government supports inclusive efforts and diplomatic initiatives to rekindle dialogue and the war. In this connection, we encourage all parties to return to the negotiating table so the killing and destruction stops, children can emerge from the bomb shelters, and soldiers return home. Third, my government continues to be gravely concerned by ongoing Russia and DPRK military cooperation, which includes illicit arms and ballistic missile transfers, as well as mass troop deployment. Reportedly, this entails 5,000 new engineering troops from DPRK that have recently begun to be dispatched to Russia. These new arrivals join the roughly 10,000 DPRK soldiers deployed around the Russian-Ukraine border, alongside another 1,000 military engineers that have been sent to remove landmines on the ground. These violate the UN Charter and Council resolutions, undermine global non-proliferation, and prolonged and internationalized the conflict, and bring security concerns on the Korean Peninsula. Mr. President, as vulnerable communities prepare the post-dark winter under fire, let us reinvigorate our efforts to end this blood chapter of war and start a new effort of peace. We reiterate our principled call for swift ceasefire and end to all hostility. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Republic of Korea for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
Mr. President, I would like to very warmly thank our Western colleagues for convening this Security Council meeting on Ukraine, because a huge corruption scandal has just erupted there. It involves top officials of the Kyiv regime. For us, this comes as no surprise. At almost every meeting, we have told you that you are dealing with a thieving, corrupt pack profiting from war with your money. It was not even a secret that fell open. It was so obvious that only the blind could fail to notice it. And here one is tempted to ask a question from a well-known skit which would be familiar to Russian and Ukrainian audiences. Question, where's the money? Answer, what money? On the 10th of November, the Ukraine's National Anti-Corruption Bureau, after a series of searches, reported uncovering large-scale embezzlement at Energoatom, which is the operator of Ukraine's nuclear power plants. According to the investigation, the organizer and the main beneficiary of the illegal enrichment scheme was Timur Mindic, Zelensky's longtime associate. NABU says that in just 1 year, members of this criminal network laundered about $100 million in kickbacks. And the same corruption scheme operated in the defense sector. The true scale of this scandal is something that we can only guess at right now, but here's just the tip of the iceberg. I haven't heard anyone at this meeting say a word about that. Meanwhile, Zelensky continues to tour European cities, begging for money and weapons to spend it for his own benefit and that of his inner circle. But Europe has no money left for Ukraine. Europe needs to rearm its own armies to prepare, as they hysterically claim, be ready for war with Russia by 2030. And where will they get money for Ukraine? Well, they can be stolen by stealing Russia's sovereign assets, for example, but this hasn't worked so far. So they resort to whipping up anti-Russian hysteria to scare and unsettle impressionable Europeans. For example, with alleged Russian drones entering airspace, the UK Defence Secretary John Healey dispatched British fighters and a frigate to monitor the Russian oceanographic vessel called Yantar. No sooner had an incident occurred with damaged railway tracks in Poland committed, according to the Polish authorities themselves, by 2 Ukrainians, than Warsaw declared, clearly without showing any evidence of the fact that the trail leads to Russia, because it was an act of state terrorism carried out by Ukrainians working for Russian intelligence. And the speed of arriving such conclusions by Polish authorities is truly astounding. We, after all, remember well who was the first to thank the United States in the Biden administration for the Nord Stream terrorist attack. It was Poland's current foreign minister, Sikorski. Now, on the ground situation, the position of Ukraine's armed forces remains dire, not to say catastrophic. Russian troops are successfully advancing on almost all fronts, essentially. According to Russia's Ministry of Defense, in the past week, several towns and villages in Kharkiv, Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporozhye regions was liberated, and in the DPR. Ukrainian military equipment, including Neptune launchers and U.S.-made HIMARS systems, are being systematically destroyed, including command posts of the Ukrainian army, fortifications, armored vehicles, ammunition depots, and drone control centers. Supply lines are also being disrupted. Ukrainian units continue to suffer heavy losses and rapidly lose fighting capability. Ukrainian forces are stymied in major strategic hubs such as Krasnoarmeysk, which is formerly Pokrovsk, in Dimitrov, and Kupiansk. Kupiansk has been liberated. Kyiv denies this, citing Russian propaganda. In late October, President Putin proposed granting unhindered access there for foreign journalists, including Ukrainian ones, to make sure that they can see firsthand what the situation is. Russian command was ready to suspend hostilities for 5 to 6 hours to create safe corridors for the press, but Kyiv, of course, refused. And leading Western media and journalist associations also remained silent. Indeed, why would you want to learn the truth that would shatter Zelensky's carefully spread myths about Ukraine's invincible army? Ukrainian failures are accompanied by very brutal actions against civilians, which remain in contested cities. Nationalists call them zhdun, those who are waiting. Those who want to stay and then later move to the Russian side. On the 14th of November, 7 civilians killed in the DPR by targeted Ukrainian drone and mortar attacks were trying to evacuate a local priest, his wife, and parish families as they were trying to evacuate. They were methodically hunted down, and then the villagers were prevented from retrieving and burying the bodies as drones continued hunting for them. The fact that Ukrainian forces use civilians as human shields, place command posts in private homes, deploy air defenses in residential areas, conduct military operations in densely populated cities is something that's also being confirmed by foreign journalists now, who can hardly be suspected of being pro-Russian. But deliberate killing of isolated civilians fleeing combat zones is beyond evil, let alone humanitarian law. Between 20th October and 16th of November of this year, 307 Russian civilians were harmed by Ukrainian shelling. 260 people were wounded, including 20 minors, and 47 were killed, and this includes 2 children. Overall, civilian targets in Russian territory during this period received at the very least 13,195 munition rounds. Villages in the Lugansk and Donetsk People's Republics, Kherson, Zaporozhye, Belgorod, Bryansk, Kursk, and Moscow regions were harmed, as well as Saratov, Novorossiysk, and Volgograd were hit. But the UN Secretary General and his spokesperson show neither courage to speak about this nor words to express sympathy for the victims. But they very readily strongly condemn any Russian strikes based on any information, be it verified or not verified, provided to them by the UN resident coordinator in Ukraine, Shmale. We're not at war with Ukrainian civilians. Our forces act with maximum responsibility, striking only military targets, and they're supporting transport, energy infrastructure of Ukraine. According to leaked military documents, Ukraine's armed forces have lost more than 1.7 million troops since the start of the special operation. And this year alone, as of August, that figure was more than 600,000. Massive, irrecoverable losses are indirectly confirmed by body exchanges. When we return thousands of Ukrainian soldiers' remains and only receive about 20-30 bodies in return. It is very clear that Ukrainian troops under these conditions are fleeing en masse. In October alone, the record 21,000 soldiers deserted, which is the equivalent of 4 brigades. To replenish the losses, Ukraine has conducted a mobilization which is an unprecedented level of violence. Borders are being closed, bank accounts frozen, driver's licenses suspended, and people are just basically being grabbed off the streets. Ukrainian propagandist here also tries to call this Russian fake news, but international media could not ignore a telling incident that occurred. In early November, Angelina Jolie visited Ukraine, and her bodyguard was detained before her very eyes and taken into a draft office. And just a couple of weeks earlier, the same treatment was meted out to a Ukrainian journalist working with British reporters from The Sun. Meanwhile, lowering the draft age from 25 to 22 is being discussed. On the 20th of November, Kyiv Mayor Vitaly Klitschko voiced this idea in Politico publication. And soon, it will very soon reach the levels of the Hitler Youth. Mr. President, despite the encirclement of large numbers of Ukrainian forces, huge losses, violent mobilization, threats to civilians, the head of the Kyiv regime forbids acknowledging the loss of cities, orders positions to be held down to the last man, and bans retreat. This policy by Ukrainian leadership has nothing to do with military reality and is purely political in nature. Zelensky wants to show his Western sponsors that the front is holding, hoping for continued funding for his war with Russia, and he needs billions to keep the war going for his own enrichment and his ilk's enrichment, and so as to stay in power. Meanwhile, Kyiv is crying out for a ceasefire. And Kyiv's European accomplices of Kyiv are saying the same thing. And the price of these calls to us is very obvious. This so-called immediate and urgent ceasefire is needed for Ukraine only to make sure that the defeated forces get a long-awaited breather. As for the hypocritical appeals for peace from our former European partners, neither Zelensky nor his handlers seek peace. An escalation serves their interests. Just last week, Ukraine's first deputy foreign minister, well known to us all, Mr. Kyslytsya, openly said that Kyiv has officially suspended peace talks with Moscow. In fact, since the summer, Ukraine stopped responding to Russia's proposals, including proposals to create working groups on political, humanitarian, and military issues. As regards the current statements made by Zelensky from Istanbul and European capitals, when they are nothing but an attempt to distract from the monstrous corruption scandal. From day one, we have been clearly stating the goals of the special military operation. Ukraine, outside of all alliances, its denazification and end to persecution of all things Russian, respect for the rights of all citizens living there. But we see no genuine desire to sit down and discuss key aspects of resolving in the Ukrainian crisis in Kyiv. Mr. President, in conclusion, I would like to yet once again state our disagreement in principle by having in this meeting so many delegations participate under Rule 37 and 39, 7 besides Ukraine. 6, rather, besides Ukraine, and all of them are either members or allies of NATO and EU. They have bloc-instilled discipline. They have no autonomy or bring no added value into a discussion. Every time they waste the precious time of the Council repeating the same theses which are the copies of statements made by the EU. We are against turning the Security Council meetings in a talk show so as to work out the guidelines for their own domestic use. We think that this undermines the procedure of the Council. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Russian Federation for the statement. And I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Director Gotoh, Director Wosornu, for your briefings today. Colleagues, we have yet another winter approaching, Ukraine's fourth, since Russia launched its invasion. And it is imperative to end this war and begin the process of rebuilding. Colleagues, diplomacy is the only path to a durable and just peace. The United States has invested at the highest levels, the President of the United States personally, to end this war. We have proposed generous terms for Russia, including sanctions relief. We have asked Russia to halt its attacks and meet directly with Ukraine to negotiate a peaceful settlement. Unfortunately, the fighting continues, tragically causing more civilian casualties. And we've also seen incursions now into the airspace of third countries, including of our NATO allies, actions that risk widening this conflict even further. Ukraine's counterattacks, in turn, have hit Russia's energy sector and other critical infrastructure, further constraining Russia's ability to fuel its war economy. And Russia has now suffered more than 1 million casualties. It has endured severe international sanctions. Colleagues, the bottom line is the costs to all sides have been devastating, and it is beyond time for this war to end. And I would hope that we would all agree that this war will not end militarily. Russia's and Ukraine's leaders must negotiate. Both Russia and Ukraine must accept a ceasefire. Further, the U.S., from the international community standpoint, the U.S. has called on all countries, particularly those in Europe, to stop buying energy resources from Russia. And we have imposed additional sanctions on Russia's two largest oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil. We did so on October 22nd. We can impose further economic costs if Russia continues to ignore calls for a ceasefire. We will also continue to make weapons available for Ukraine's defense. Colleagues, finally, we cannot let this meeting pass without calling for the return of the kidnapped and missing children from Ukraine, for the resolution of that issue. And colleagues, under President Trump's leadership, the United States will continue to pursue a path to peace in Ukraine. We ask all UN member states to join us in supporting these efforts, calling for a ceasefire, and ending this war. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement, and I'll give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Mr. President, allow me at the outset to thank Ms. Kayoko Gotoh and Ms. Edem Wosornu for their valuable briefings. Mr. President, the current developments in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict reflect yet another scene of escalation, marked by ongoing military clashes that continue day after day to pose a grave threat to international peace and security. My country expresses its deep concern over the intensification of the conflict and the continuation of military attacks between the parties, particularly the use of missiles and drones. We believe that prolonging this conflict will only lead to further deterioration of the humanitarian situation, more civilian casualties, including women, children, and the elderly, and devastating damage to essential infrastructure, especially as we approach the winter season. What is equally troubling is the persistence of the logic of escalation between the parties, despite the mediation initiatives we have witnessed, which aimed to ease tensions, bring positions closer together, and achieve progress in the search for a peaceful political solution acceptable to both sides, thereby putting an end to this war. In this regard, my delegation wishes to emphasize the following points. 1. Algeria reiterates its call for a definitive end to hostilities between the parties. Once again, we condemn the violations of international law and urge both sides to abide by its rules, including the provisions of international humanitarian law, in order to prevent further deterioration of the humanitarian situation and to ensure the protection of innocent civilians as well as vital civilian infrastructures. 2. We urge both Russia and Ukraine to uphold the spirit of dialogue and negotiation as a matter of utmost priority and as the most effective option to calm the situation and develop common understandings, rather than just resorting to escalation and confrontation, which will only heighten security concerns and undermine international peace and security. 3. Algeria encourages both parties to renew their constructive engagement in good faith in direct negotiations and to intensify diplomatic efforts to revive the peaceful track of the conflict in a continuous and sustainable manner. In this context, we call for strengthened and promoting consultations to resume prisoner exchanges and the release of detainees, with a view to fostering consensus-building efforts and paving the way for joint action towards resolving this conflict. 4. We also call upon the international community to contribute constructively away from polarization and geopolitical rivalries in order to reduce divergences between the parties and avoid military escalation, in order to facilitate opportunities for a fair and lasting settlement between the parties. In conclusion, we remain committed to supporting all international efforts to achieve a just and lasting political solution, one that is grounded in the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and that takes into account the legitimate security concerns of both parties. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for the statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Sierra Leone. Colleagues, Sierra Leone notes the imperative of lasting peace and stability in Ukraine and the wider European region. This meeting must therefore support the path to peace through dialogue. I thank Officer in Charge Kayoko Gotoh and Director Edem Wosornu for their briefings. As the Russian-Ukraine conflict enters its 1,365th day, the civilian population continues to suffer. The United Nations monitoring mission in Ukraine has reported that civilian casualties from January to October 2025 has been significantly higher than the same period last year, with at least 14,500 civilians in Ukraine killed since February 2022. It is way past time for the conflict parties to engage in diplomatic dialogue, to seek a cessation of hostilities, and work towards a political solution to end the conflict. As we've heard from our briefers today, the intensified use of long-range missiles and drones in heavily populated areas of Ukraine continues to result in fatalities and injuries for civilians, including children. The drone attack on a kindergarten in Kyiv last month, which resulted in 1 death and over 9 injuries, and for which we can only hope the innocent children who had to be evacuated to shelters can recover, is emblematic of the dire impact of this conflict. The horrors of war faced by millions of children in Ukraine, as well as in Russia, should serve as an impetus for the conflict parties to respond to continuous call for an immediate ceasefire and a lasting peace through dialogue by the members of the Council. Sierra Leone is particularly concerned that as fighting continues for a 4th winter of sub-zero temperatures, the people of Ukraine face heightened risk of death and suffering. The deliberate targeting of energy infrastructure in this conflict has resulted in widespread destruction of the country's power grid, which is reportedly operating at a third of its generation and transmission capacity. Increased power outages and prolonged disruption of heating, electricity, and water supply further endanger the lives of the elderly, disabled, and millions of displaced persons, deepening the humanitarian crisis. Attacks and damage to energy facilities have further disrupted learning for the millions of children in Ukraine who are enrolled in online learning. The targeted attack on civilians and civilian infrastructure that have characterized this conflict as serious violations of international humanitarian law. Military operations around nuclear sites and other critical energy infrastructure are unacceptable and contrary to IHL. So it reiterates its call for the parties to the conflict to respect international law, in particular international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Civilians must be protected from harm, including by taking necessary precautions to spare them from military attacks. In this regard, we urge the parties to the conflict to refrain from operating in and around civilian infrastructure, including deliberate targeting of energy, water, sanitation systems, which are essential to life. Noting the warning from OCHA and other humanitarian organizations that this coming winter will be particularly difficult for people in Ukraine, faced with soaring prices, job losses, and little or no income and savings in a wartime economy. So it calls for urgent and increased support for the humanitarian response plan, including the winterization aid plans that provide cash assistance, food, water, medicine, and essential winter supplies to millions of people. Colleagues, the Security Council has to ensure the implementation of Resolution 2774. After almost 4 years of fighting, it is clear that this conflict will not address the legitimate concerns of the parties without negotiations. We therefore reiterate our call for the parties to the conflict to engage in good faith diplomatic dialogue towards an immediate cessation of hostilities, a ceasefire as the first step to an agreement for lasting peace in line with Article 33 of the Charter of the United Nations. We reiterate our call for the respect of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, and as well the legitimate concerns of all parties to be addressed. I thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. And now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wish to thank Sierra Leone Presidency for convening today's meeting. We are also grateful to the briefers from DPPA, Ms. Kayoko Gotoh, and OCHA, Ms. Edem Wosornu, for their comprehensive and principled presentations. Thank you to Council members for the decisive, strong statements, despite the propaganda and manipulation and lies that come from behind the nameplate Russian Federation. Since the Council last met on Ukraine in September, the security situation in my country has worsened dramatically. As we heard from the briefers, the Russian Federation has unleashed an even more brutal campaign of terror against civilians, relentless daily missile and drone attacks. Yesterday marked yet another dark chapter in this war, one that will forever stand as a testament to Russia's vicious brutality and disregard for human life. Russian drones and missiles deliberately targeted residential buildings, the very place where people should feel safest. This latest strike involved 48 missiles, an enormous barrage, and 476 attack drones. In the city of Ternopil, a deliberate direct hit by a Russian missile has destroyed a 9-story residential building. This is what Russian attacks on military objects mean. As of today's morning, 28 people, including 3 children, have been confirmed killed and 94 injured, including 18 children. 16 people still remain missing. This is the reality Ukraine is forced to confront every single day. Attacks against children, women, and elderly, families in their homes, patients in their hospitals, and teachers and students in schools. Deliberate attacks on civilian infrastructure, energy facilities, and power grids. Deliberate attacks Dozens of cities, hundreds of towns, and thousands of villages razed to the ground. Millions of people left without heat, light, or water during the harsh winter season. And as a result of the attack by Russia, which took place during this very meeting, at least 5 have been killed and 3 more wounded in Zaporizhia. The human toll is devastating and the destruction unimaginable. This is a systematic and deliberate policy aimed at annihilating the Ukrainian people. Culture, identity, historical heritage, and our right to exist as a free and dignified nation. This is an attempt to freeze, silence, and extinguish Ukrainian resilience. This is a state terror and genocide. Mr. President, Russia's relentless escalation is not only a military assault, but also a blatant renunciation of peace itself. Every missile it launches is a statement that Moscow prefers escalation over dialogue. From the very first seconds of Russia's invasion, Ukraine has sought peace, and we support all substantive proposals capable for bringing genuine peace to get closer. Since the beginning of this year, Ukraine has supported President Trump's proposals aimed at ending the war. We are ready as before to work constructively with the American side as well as with our European partners and around the world so that the outcome is peace. Ukraine has officially received from the American side a draft plan. We outlined the fundamental principles that matter to our people. We agree to work on the plan's provisions in a way that would bring about a just end of the war. In this context, allow me to make several critical points. First, while Ukraine stands ready to engage in meaningful negotiations to end this war, including at the leaders' level, our red lines are clear and unwavering. There will never be any recognition, formal or otherwise, of Ukrainian territory temporarily occupied by the Russian Federation as Russian. Our land is not for sale. Ukraine will not accept any limits on its right to self-defense or on the size and capabilities of our armed forces. Nor will we tolerate any infringement on our sovereignty, including our sovereign right to choose the alliances we want to join. Any genuine peace process must respect a fundamental principle: nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, and nothing about Europe without Europe. And let me be equally clear, we will not reward the genocidal intent that underpins Russian aggression by undermining our identity, including our language. Second, support for Ukraine is indispensable. Peace requires strengthened security and sustained financial assistance to Ukraine. Reinforcing Ukraine's defense capabilities is not an escalation. It is the only path to compelling Russia to engage constructively in international peace efforts. In this regard, we express profound gratitude to all partners and allies. This support is an investment in the rules-based international order and global peace. Third, the Kremlin regime will not stop unless it is stopped through unyielding and concerted pressure. There is only one realistic path to ending this war. Russia must be compelled to retreat economically, politically, and militarily. If we fail to stop Russia now, its aggression will not end with Ukraine. It will continue to export war, occupation, and repression. It will commit more atrocities, torture, inhuman treatment of civilians and prisoners of war, widespread sexual violence, the abduction of children, the destruction of cultural heritage, and environmental devastation. Europe has lived through this before, and we must not dare forget those lessons. History will be a merciless judge if Russia is eventually rewarded of its war of aggression instead of held accountable. Fourth, the end of the war and the role of this Council. Ukraine has repeatedly called on this Council to adopt a resolution demanding a full, immediate, and unconditional ceasefire. Our people deserve to feel free and protected. A ceasefire is an essential prerequisite for meaningful negotiations. It is the first step toward halting Russia's war of aggression and creating space for diplomacy. We reiterate our call on the Council members to adopt a resolution demanding a full, immediate, and unconditional ceasefire. Mr. President, today the world marks World Children's Day and reaffirms that every child has the inherent right to life, to grow up in a safe environment, to preserve their identity, to remain with their family whenever possible, and to enjoy their childhood and future. Yet in Ukraine, Russia's contribution to this global observance is the bodies of Ukrainian children pulled from beneath the rubble. Since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, almost 700 children were killed, more than 2,000 have been wounded, tens of thousands have been forcibly transferred and deported. We cannot bring back the children whom this war has already taken. We cannot undo the horrors that Russia has inflicted on Ukrainian boys and girls. But there is one thing we can still do and must do together. We can stop the abduction of Ukrainian children. We can end this crime now before more young lives are stolen, before more families are torn apart. That is why Ukraine has presented to UN member states the draft UNGA resolution, Return of Ukrainian Children. Its message is clear and simple and contains of three key elements. The Russian Federation must ensure the immediate, safe, and unconditional return of all Ukrainian forcibly transferred or deported children. The Russian Federation must cease without delay any further practices of forcible transfer, deportation, separation from families, change of personal status, including citizenship or adoption, and indoctrination of Ukrainian children. The Secretary General is requested to exercise his good offices and take all necessary steps to facilitate the return of Ukrainian children. The vote will take place in early December, and we call on all member states to support this concrete humanitarian initiative. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for the statement. I'll now give the floor to the representative of Lithuania.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and my own country, Lithuania. We also align ourselves with the statement by the European Union. I sincerely thank the UN briefers for their substantive reports. We are shocked by yet another drone and missile attack on Ukraine yesterday. Russia fired 476 drones and 48 missiles that killed 25 people and in an apartment building in the city of Ternopil, with about 80 others wounded. We reiterate our full support and gratitude to the UNDP resident coordinator, Matthias Schmale, and his team, as well as UN agencies providing humanitarian assistance across Ukraine in the extremely dangerous environment. The Baltic states strongly condemn Russia's continuous daily attacks on Ukraine, striking and killing civilians, bombing hospitals, schools and kindergartens, targeting energy infrastructure, and triggering more power outages across the country. These are blunt violations of international law. The UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine has verified that in October, at least 148 civilians were killed and 929 injured. The casualty rates continue to increase by 27% compared to last year until November. This reflects a sharp escalation in violence against civilians and critical civilian infrastructure, and is especially worrying with the upcoming winter. Such attacks constitute war crimes and deprive civilians of elementary humanitarian needs and fundamental rights. For 4 years now, Russia is continuing its terror against civilians. The latest report by the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine states that Russian authorities have systematically coordinated actions to drive out Ukrainian civilians from their homes in the occupied territories. Russia's military intentionally targets civilians and civilian objects in brutal, as they call, human safari in the frontline areas. Russia also has forcibly conscripted Ukrainians in the territories it occupies, mobilizing high numbers of the residents into the ranks of its armed forces. The Baltic states continue to be particularly alarmed by the continuous forcible transfer and deportation of Ukrainian children to Russia and Belarus. We therefore firmly support Ukraine's resolution addressing the situation of Ukrainian children and the urgent need to ensure their safe return. Mr. President, we are equally alarmed by the horrendous treatment of Ukrainian prisoners of war amid consistent reports of torture, ill treatment, and summary executions. Such a treatment is a war crime and must be prosecuted accordingly. We are also concerned by the growing number of uses of ammunition containing hazardous chemical against Ukrainian military personnel in violation of Chemical Weapons Convention. Moreover, the attacks on the substations of the nuclear power plants show blatant disregard of nuclear safety and security in Ukraine. In October, due to the Russian strikes, all Ukraine's operating nuclear power plants had to revert to emergency generators. Russia systematically destroys Ukrainian energy infrastructure with the aim of creating unbearable living conditions for the civilian population, particularly during the harsh winter season. We call on the member states and UN institutions to continue their assistance for the maintenance of the critical energy infrastructure of Ukraine. The Baltic states will continue to support Ukraine's energy infrastructure, including supplying the necessary equipment. Mr. President, Russia's aggression is no longer confined to Ukraine's borders and is spilling across Europe. Russian nationals, shadow fleet operators, and other agents are conducting sabotage and engaging in clandestine activities. We recall the recent council meetings on drones in Poland and fighter planes in Estonia. On behalf of my own country, I would like to reiterate the persistent and provocative actions of Russia's ally Belarus, as I have recently written in a letter informing the Security Council. The Baltic states called on the Council members to condemn the ongoing hybrid operations by Russia and its supporter Belarus, as they may lead to the further escalation. These irresponsible and dangerous actions must be ceased immediately. Mr. President, for months, Russia has rejected all calls by the international community to stop its war. 9 months ago, the Security Council, including Russia, adopted a resolution calling for a swift end to the conflict and urging a lasting peace between Ukraine and Russia. Already in March, Ukraine committed to an immediate, full and unconditional ceasefire. Russia is the only obstacle to peace in Ukraine. Russia can end the war now, stop its military actions, and participate in meaningful negotiations. We reiterate our support to the US President Donald Trump's efforts and his call to begin direct negotiations to end Russia's war once and for all. The Baltic states call on Russia to stop the war immediately, agree to the ceasefire, and start meaningful negotiations. We urge all UN member states to increase pressure on Russia by strengthening the sanctions and by providing greater political, military, and humanitarian support to Ukraine. The Baltic states reaffirm our strong commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity, and we will continue to provide Ukraine with lasting support to achieve an immediate, comprehensive, just, and sustainable peace in full compliance with international law, including UN Charter. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Lithuania for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Mr. President, let me thank Sierra Leone for convening this meeting and our briefers for their updates and informative briefings. Mr. President, the permanent member of this Council, the Russian Federation, persists in making the travesty of its presumed role as a guardian of international peace and security. More than 1,300 days into a full-scale invasion of its peaceful neighbor, Moscow has now launched one of its fiercest offensives in months. We are witnessing heavy strikes in frontline locations, attacks on residential areas, destruction of critical infrastructure, torture and killing of detainees, and continuous deportation of Ukrainian children. As we all heard today in the interventions, yesterday at least 25 people were killed, including 3 children, in the missile drone attack on the city of Ternopil. Russia carried out this attack against the civilian apartment blocks. They directed missiles and drones into the people's homes. Mr. President, 2 months ago, the Council met at the request of my country, following Russia's violation of the Polish airspace with its drones. Now we are facing another major escalation, of which I would like this Council to be rightly informed against the Russian disinformation. On November 15 to 16, 2 acts of diversion targeting Polish railway infrastructure occurred, including the blowing up of a section of the track on the Warsaw-Lublin route, which is crucially important for the delivery of the aid, including the United Nations assistance, to Ukraine. According to the investigation, these were intentional actions aimed at causing a railway disaster. Many people's lives were put at risk. These were the most serious acts of sabotage against Poland since the beginning of Russia's full-scale aggression against Ukraine. Fortunately, a tragedy was averted, but another line was crossed. These actions are evidence of how Russia is spreading its aggression into other countries in the region. 2 saboteurs were promptly identified as, of course, individuals bearing the Ukrainian passports, but one of them was sentenced already in May 2025 by Ukrainian court of an act of sabotage committed on behalf of the Russian security services. The other one was of Donbas origin. Both fled from Ukraine to Belarus, where they were also went after committing the sabotage operation in Poland. As predicted, the incidents are being followed by the Russian propaganda and disinformation, conduct we witnessed all too often in this chamber also today. Russian media are attempting to portray the sabotage as a Ukrainian provocation. We are closely monitoring the information sphere and Russia's attempts to inflict the damage there, as well as to sow divisions within our own society. Mr. President, all this is happening in defiance of diplomatic initiatives, especially those led by the United States and President Trump, and despite the will of the international community repeatedly expressed here at the UN. Russia has consistently chosen war over peace, destruction over building, and death over life. For self-interest elites in the Kremlin, the massive loss of life, even among Russian soldiers, and the deepening economic crisis at home are of no importance. Moscow shows no interest in halting its unprovoked aggression against Ukraine and even rejects a ceasefire. We will, however, continue to support a just peace in Ukraine, one that is acceptable and supported by Ukraine as a victim of aggression and in accordance with the principles of international law. We must hold Russia accountable for its actions and deter future wars in our region and beyond. Mr. President, Ukraine's reconstruction will remain our high priority. Poland will host the Ukraine Recovery Conference in 2026, aiming to strengthen the coordination of reconstruction efforts and mobilize the support of all international partners in order to accelerate Ukraine's recovery and modernization. Poland will also continue to support the provision of military assistance to Ukraine, as well as economic sanctions against Russia in order to curb its ability to fuel the war. We call on all peace-loving countries to join in those efforts. Russian authorities must be forced into talks by stronger sanctions and by increasing economic cost of war. The alternative is very grim. The Kremlin's imperialist, neo-colonial demands would in fact deprive Ukraine of its sovereignty and will re-establish the spheres of influence. We reject the very idea of such spheres of influence. We cannot allow the aggressor to intimidate the international community. And in this conflict, there is only one and sole aggressor, and that's the Russian Federation. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Poland for the statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, Head of Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you to the Presidency for convening this meeting, and thank you to the briefers for their updates. Colleagues, in the 2 months since this Council last convened to address Russia's aggression against Ukraine, the aggressor state has further increased the intensity of its missile and drone strikes, once again throwing aside the calls of members of this Council. It doesn't care. It has, in fact, increased its systematical targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure in clear violation of international law. On Tuesday, Russian attacks reportedly killed at least 25 people, including children, in 2 residential areas in Chernobyl. Earlier this week, we learned of an unprecedented act of sabotage involving the blowing up of a railway track in Poland. This incident directly concerns the security of an EU member state and its civilians. The threats to our security are real and growing. After investigations, the sabotage was attributed to individuals previously accused of cooperating with Russia. Russia continues to demonstrate what we have repeatedly warned about in this chamber. Not only that it lacks any real political will to end its aggression and engage in meaningful peace negotiations, but fundamentally that the only real root cause of this war is its desire to recolonize by force 34 years after it regained its independence as sovereign and independent member of these United Nations. Colleagues, the UN, in case we forget, was created to promote decolonization, not recolonization. Russia may want us to forget this, but we won't. While Russia cynically attacks Ukraine's energy sector ahead of a harsh winter, the call for an immediate, full, and unconditional ceasefire grows even louder. Ukraine demonstrated its readiness months ago. The UN Secretary General reiterated his call yesterday after yet another brutal overnight barrage when he called for a ceasefire, and I quote him, as a first step towards a just, comprehensive, and sustainable peace that fully upholds Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, in line with the UN Charter, international law, and relevant UN resolutions, unquote. All members of the Security Council repeated this call today. All except one, Russia. We welcome recent statements to this end by many countries from around the world as well. A ceasefire is a first necessary step towards a just and lasting peace. So today, we once again echo this message to Russia. Stop the killing, stop it, and join Ukraine at the negotiating table. There's a shocking truth, dear colleagues, about this war. According to credible reports, more than 1 million Russian soldiers have been killed or injured trying to conquer Ukraine. On many days, more than 1,000 young Russian men and women perish on the battlefield far from their homes. Over 3 years into what it had planned to be, remember, a 3-day war, Russia continues to be countered by the brave Ukrainian soldiers day after day. Colleagues, the European Union will sustain its diplomatic efforts towards peace, together with the United States and other partners. We will continue supporting Ukraine so it can remain in a position of strength with the means to continue exercising its inherent right to self-defense. Before, during, and after any ceasefire, this includes political, financial, humanitarian, military, reconstruction, diplomatic support. And we will further increase our coordinated pressure on Russia until it stops its war. All of us in this room should do that. When the European Union calls to increase pressure on Russia, it is not to prolong the war, but to push for peace, to create incentives for Russia to stop its systematic attacks, which include violations of European airspace, by the way, and to generally sit down for talks. Remember, Russia too committed itself to this by voting in favor of the Path to Peace resolution in February of this year. But then again, Russia may feel little compulsion to comply with Security Council resolutions or any other resolutions of the UN if third countries and actors and entities therein continue enabling Russia's war of aggression. We condemn again the continued military support provided by Iran, by Belarus, and by the DPRK, and we urge all countries, including members of this Council, to immediately cease any direct or indirect assistance to Russia in its war of aggression. And we call on Russia and Belarus to immediately ensure the safe return to Ukraine of all Ukrainian children unlawfully transferred and deported to Russia and Belarus. We fully support Ukraine's initiative to seize the General Assembly of the immediate need to return the Ukrainian children. The international community must do everything in its power to take concrete measures that facilitate that safe return. Colleagues, in closing, I reaffirm our continued and unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. This may sound like an obvious point, but it is one worth repeating in case Russia hopes that the blatant violation of the UN Charter by a permanent member of this Security Council can be normalized, so long it is continued unabated, and so long as the aggression gets worse. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Lambrinidis, for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of Germany.
Mr. President, I thank the briefers for their insightful remarks at the beginning, and I would like to thank you, Mr. President, for holding this timely debate. It is timely because it is essential that we speak about the continued erosion of the fundamental norms and principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations that Russia causes. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine should be seen for what it is, an assault on these basic tenets of peaceful coexistence, and the incessant and ongoing attacks affect key principles that form the basis of our cooperations in these halls, and they pose a threat to regional security as well as to global peace and stability. It therefore necessitates a collective and decisive response by member states. And I would like to make the following 3 points. Firstly, it is rare that in a conflict, a war, one party is so clearly responsible for its start and for its continuation. Russia deems the fighting and killing more advantageous to its plans of territorial conquest than peace. Ukraine, on the other hand, has reiterated time and again that it is willing to negotiate in good faith to find a peaceful solution. And at the onset of winter, Russia is deliberately targeting civilian infrastructure in Ukraine with rocket and drone strikes, as we've heard. Such attacks are coldly calculated to demoralize the civilian population and in clear breach of international humanitarian law. Families, the elderly, and children, the entire population is suffering. Secondly, the security of most, if not all, member states of the United Nations depends on the upholding of international law. That is why we must preserve the inviolability of the UN Charter and the fundamental rules and principles laid out therein. The invasion of a peaceful country by a permanent member of the Security Council represents a perversion of the UN system which we must never normalize or accept. The privilege of permanent Security Council membership entails a special duty to uphold the UN Charter. Thirdly, a call for an immediate and unconditional and comprehensive ceasefire should be a step which we can all support. It would at once reduce the prolonged and unnecessary suffering of the civilian population, because as the war grinds on, the harmful impacts of the conflict continue to extend beyond Ukraine. That is evident in countless violations of European airspace, as well as most recently the acts of sabotage against Polish rail infrastructure. Mr. President, we will not rest until a sustainable and just peace is achieved, a peace that is rooted in the principles of the UN Charter and negotiated with Ukraine at the table. We need an unconditional ceasefire now to stop the bloodshed and to lay the foundation of trust for sincere negotiations. The people of Ukraine have the right to live in peace and security, and Germany continues to support Ukraine in exercising its legitimate right to self-defense. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Germany for the statement, and now give the floor to the representative of Romania.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Since the Council addressed last September the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, Russia pursued a path of further escalation, increasing the intensity of its missiles and drone strikes. We are appalled by Russia's recent attacks on residential areas in Ternopil, one of the deadliest attacks against civilians so far, following previous waves of large-scale missile and drone strikes on several Ukrainian regions that brought death and grievance to civilians. Russia intentionally targeted critical energy infrastructure. Attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure violate international humanitarian law. Such attacks, strongly condemned by the Secretary General, are unacceptable and must stop. We reiterate our support and solidarity with Ukraine. The aggressor must not be rewarded with impunity, accountability is needed more than ever. Mr. President, as a country with the longest border Ukraine has with a friendly neighbor, we are concerned with Russia's irresponsible behavior as it continues to attack Ukrainian civilian infrastructure also in the vicinity of Romania. During the night of 10 to 11th of November 2025, an unmanned aerial vehicle of the Russian military forces violated yet again the Romanian airspace. The fragments recovered by the Romanian authorities from the crash site of the aircraft undoubtedly prove its affiliation and involvement in the massive attack that same night against Ukrainian civilian infrastructure located in the vicinity of Romania. The latest violation of our airspace took place yesterday, November 19th. Following another Russian attack on the Danube port infrastructure of Ukraine in the night of 16 to 17 November 2025, an LNG vessel took fire in the Ukrainian port of Izmail on the Danube, just across the border with Romania. In light of the increased risk of a potential explosion, the Romanian authorities took the extraordinary measure of temporarily evacuating 2 nearby villages to ensure the safety of their inhabitants. Russia is a permanent member of this body and is expected to be a guarantor of international law and the UN Charter, and such actions are unacceptable. We strongly condemn the repetitive nature of violations of the Romanian airspace by Russian drones, which poses serious risks for the safety of Romanian citizens, as well for the security of Romania and the region at large. Mr. President, it is imperative to exert massive pressure to stop this unprovoked war. Romania will fully implement the United States and international sanctions imposed on Lukoil. At the same time, the violation of EU restrictive measures is now a crime and can be punished with imprisonment according to a draft law adopted by the Romanian government just in the past few days. Our long-standing position since day one of the invasion of Ukraine is clear. The achievement of a comprehensive, just and lasting peace needs to be in line with the UN Charter and the principle of sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity. We simply cannot reward an aggressor which has a historical record of relapsing in breaching international law. We reiterate our continued support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, as well as for its legitimate right to self-defense under the UN Charter. A full, immediate and unconditional ceasefire remains necessary as a first step towards a comprehensive, just and lasting peace. And just to echo the points made by the US Secretary of State today, it is high time to, quote, for an extensive exchange of serious and realistic ideas, unquote. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Romania for the statement. And I give the floor to the representative of Sweden.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the 5 Nordic countries, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and my own country, Sweden. We thank DPPA and OCHA for the briefings, and we commend the bravery and professionalism of all humanitarian workers. Mr. President, we meet in the wake of renewed, large-scale Russian attacks against civilians and civilian objects in Ukraine. The recent drone and missile barrage at Ternopil, Lviv, and Ivano-Frankivsk claimed at least 25 civilian lives, left hundreds injured, and caused extensive electricity blackouts. This is no coincidence. As we approach the 4th winter of Russia's full-scale invasion, we once again witness Russia's deliberate targeting of residential areas and energy infrastructure across Ukraine. In addition, Russia continues its attack on humanitarian personnel. On the 14th of October, 4 clearly marked UN trucks were struck by Russian drones as they delivered aid to Kherson. The UN has confirmed this attack. The purpose of Russia's recurring assaults is clear: to destabilize, to deepen humanitarian suffering, and to erode the resilience of the Ukrainian people. In essence, it's a systematic strategy of terror against civilians, aimed at fulfilling Russia's political objective, the subjugation of Ukraine or the annexation of its sovereign territory. Yet, as in previous years, Russia will fail. We remain in awe of Ukraine's resilience. Mr. President, on the 21st of October, the Independent International Commission on Inquiry released another report on Russia's continued violations of international humanitarian law. The report concludes that Russia's targeted drone strikes against civilians form part of a coordinated policy that not only constitutes war crimes, but even more gravely amounts to the crimes against humanity of murder and the forcible transfer of population. We cannot allow these attacks to be met with impunity. There must be accountability for the crimes committed against and within Ukraine. Appeasement or a lack of action would only embolden the aggressor and risk sowing instability elsewhere. Mr. President, the Nordics will continue to support Ukraine in its pursuit of a just and sustainable peace in accordance with international law and the UN Charter. The Nordic countries do not recognize spheres of influence nor territorial acquisitions through the use of force. We urge Russia to immediately cease its aggression and to comply with international humanitarian law. Russia must protect civilians and humanitarian workers, return the forcibly transferred and unlawfully deported children, and it must accept that Ukraine, like any other country, has a sovereign right to choose its own future. President, to sum up, Russia's actions demonstrate a clear lack of genuine intent to pursue peace. We must remember that this is a Russian war of choice. If President Putin so wished, he could cease the aggression and end the war tomorrow. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Sweden for the statement. There are no more names described on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.